Competitive games like racing simulators tend to be a strong driver for Gittin Gud. There's various avenues you can take to achieve that goal, and usually that's dictated by whatever you're directly struggling with or lacking in. You'll find a ton of videos covering these topics, and even coaching services to run you through them. I think there's one major skill that I don't see talked about very much in the sim racing space, which I believe is always relevant at all skill levels, and that I find tends to have a major impact on how I perform. That skill is emotional resilience. The race you're seeing here is a good example of what I'm talking about. I qualified in 4th, but during turn 3 on the first lap I made a stupid mistake which took me off and put me in dead last. Needless to say, it was a frustrating scenario and practically the natural habitat for an emotional spat, but I'm going to let this play out in the background and we'll return to it at the end. While this is something of a more abstract concept, and for many I'm sure it feels like a personal or uncomfortable subject, I think people overlook emotional resilience because it's usually hard to see. When you've got your head under control, you and those around you won't really notice it, but if you're caught slipping, hoo boy will it stick out like a sore thumb. Rage quitters, rammers, and toxic chat exchanges tend to be real head turners, and if you find yourself stewing in your own self-doubts and inward discouragement during a race, your mind is likely to be totally inundated and you won't be thinking about a whole lot else. I'm not trying to pass myself off as an armchair psychologist here, I just want to talk about my experience with this, which I suspect some of you will be able to relate to on some level and hopefully learn something from. I have a history of getting either mad, sad, or both when playing games, whether it's video games, physical sport, tabletop games, parlor games, or whatever else you can think of. The thing is, it doesn't tend to be directed at the actual game or at the people I'm playing with, it's predominantly at myself. It's more of an inward frustration and self-loathing if I screw up where I was expecting to succeed. That's why I called my channel Diaries of a Bad Driver. That's a pretty typical example of how I talk down to myself when things aren't going my way. I've found that changing my emotional response to mistakes or failure is best served by changing my perception of those mistakes or failure. Those butt-blasted moments are such an easy trap to fall into because of the context of our lives that surrounds these virtual races. You've taken time out of your busy day not only for the race itself, but to practice and prepare in advance, hopefully, only for something to go wrong that ruins it, whether it's by your own hand or someone else's. In that heated instant, it's way too easy to fixate on the feeling of having your time wasted, or that your efforts to improve your driving or to learn the circuit were for naught, or that your hard-earned I-rating or safety rating have been snatched away. It's really important to recognise in that moment of severely rustled jimmies that you're not seeing the forest for the trees. Have you ever seen The Sopranos? There's this one dipshit character in the show, Jackie Jr. Without spoiling anything, he makes a very poor life decision, and whilst playing a contemplative game of chess, he rage quits. Omar from The Wire gives him a very important piece of advice.
I see you should have played that out. That's the only way you're going to learn.
Which he completely fails to heed, and instead has himself an unfortunate run-in with a parade float. The point is, Omar was right. Play it out. Learn to live with making mistakes, and rather than fixating on what you lost because of that mistake, figure out what you gained from it. If you're anything like me, the reality is that in almost every case where something went wrong, there was something you could have done better. Once you realise that, you now have a direct avenue to prevent that same situation recurring in the future. I, for one, think that that is an immensely less frustrating prospect than believing that the universe has it in for you, and that all of these accidents keep falling out of the sky, or that they're solely the fault of others. Those incidents do happen, of course, but they're the exception, not the rule. You are the common denominator, so you have the power to do something about it. Being able to reflect on and analyse these situations after the fact, usually with the help of the replay, is all well and good, but it might not help you all that much during the actual race, right in the thick of the moment when something goes wrong. Historically, this is where I really struggle, and I'm often sucked into a vortex of self-sustaining discouragement, or even the occasional rage quit. Fortunately, there's no bullshit in the world that you can't cut through, as long as you've got a sharp enough blade. In this case, I have two. Self-awareness and pattern recognition. On the self-awareness front, I find that it helps to remind myself that I'm not being rational. I'm sure we've all had experiences dealing with someone who has lost their emotional composure. I would say in most cases it is extremely difficult, if not functionally impossible, to have a sensible discourse with them. Well, that also applies to your own inner monologue. Sometimes you have to recognize that it's drunk and that you are well within your rights to tell it that it's had enough. This can be tricky to recognize though, because those negative thoughts can do one hell of an imitation of rationality. There often seems to be a twisted, malicious logic to those thoughts, but as a rule of thumb, if your thought patterns aren't constructive, you're probably emotionally compromised and it's time to turn down that racket because it's not real music. As for pattern recognition, I think it's effective to acknowledge that this has all happened before, because those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. Perhaps you have an incident and you find yourself having thoughts along the lines of, "You see, something always goes wrong, you'll never get good." You've almost certainly had a very similar train of thought during a race in the past, only for a following race to go really well for you. Your failures and mistakes are not the full picture on their own, so keeping your successes in mind is really important. And if you don't have a specific example that you can reach for, you can fall back on the more general but no less valid wisdom that the future is not set, and that thinking it is not only is a fallacy, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you decide that something isn't going to happen when you are the primary driving force behind it, of course it won't. Another thing you can try is listening to music while you race. I find that for whatever reason, a lot of music really hits different when driving, either in sim or on the real roads. I'm sure you have at least a few choice tracks or albums you can think of which would be suitable, so give it a shot to see if it helps you keep your spirits up. So, returning to the race, I managed to claw my way back from last place to a second place finish. By my humble standards, that was practically a miracle run, but the point is that it would never have happened if I'd gone into that demoralization spiral that can be oh so tempting to indulge yourself in. The point of this video isn't necessarily to be a step-by-step tutorial, though if you find these particular strategies work for you, then that's awesome. My ultimate point here is to get you to start thinking about it and trying to analyze those feelings after they've passed, recognizing them for what they really are and finding ways of more easily dismantling them when they occur. Start stacking that ammo and get to blasting when the time comes. If this is something that you've worked on yourself, I'd love to hear what strategies or techniques you use to keep yourself in a winning headspace. Let me know about it in the comments. Thanks for hearing me out on this. It's perhaps a bit of an unusual subject in this particular space or hobby, but I think it's a discussion worth having and a skill worth honing for life in general. If you'd like to see more sim racing content, feel free to like, subscribe and hit that bell. Until next time, don't cross the road or walk down the street. Keep it 55th.